Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And this show is going to be on the week after Thanksgiving, so it seems an appropriate time for me to do what I do pretty much every year around this time and say to you, gather around, kiddies. I'm going to tell you the real story, the based on actual historical sources story of the first Thanksgiving. By which, of course, I mean the event that occurred in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts in the fall of 1621, which is the basis for our now traditional Thanksgiving holiday. One of the reasons I do this almost every year is that it's truly amazing just how much mythology, misinformation, and general muddle-headedness there is about this. In fact, it seems what could fairly be called revisionist history of the event has become almost as traditional as turkey and pumpkin pie. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I saw a program on the BBC that not only treated those who settled Plymouth in 1620 and those who settled Boston in 1630 as if they were one group of people with identical views about religion, which they weren't, but they actually claimed that those people came to this continent in order to religiously oppress others, arguing that the thing was they couldn't stand how much religious pluralism there was in England. England at the time being a country where you were required by law to be part of the Church of England and could be imprisoned if you weren't. In fact, some Mayflower passengers had been in prison as a result of that. A country where the King of England, King James, was saying of all religious dissenters, including other Protestants as well as Catholics and Unitarians, said, "I will force them to conform or I will harry them out of the land." And oh, by the way, a country where just 40 years earlier, Protestants were being burned at the stake for the crime of not being Roman Catholic. Now, the justification for this claim they made was based on the Toleration Acts, which were passed in 1682, which was more than 60 years after the event, and on the other side of the English Civil War, and a law which allowed people like Baptists to have their services openly and freely, but still said they could not be in Parliament, and in fact didn't apply at all to Catholics or Unitarians. So suffice it to say, I was not impressed with the historical accuracy of the account here, and I like to bring some hard-headed history to this entire discussion. So, to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. Those 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, our greatest King Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. That comes from a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written to an otherwise unidentified, loving and old friend in England by Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and a leader in the early years of the colony. By the way, this portrait of Winslow was done in 1651, 30 years later, and after he had returned to England. Did I say 31? 1651. The importance of it is that it is the only verified picture of a Mayflower passenger known to exist. As for the rest of them, we have no idea what they look like, beyond the traditional description of Miles Standish as being short with red hair, a description given some backing by the fact that in a book called The New English Canaan, a rather nasty satire of the Plymouth settlement written by a man named Thomas Morton in 1637, in that book, Captain Standish is identified by the name Captain Shrimp. Winslow's letter was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantations Settled at Plymouth in New England by certain English adventurers, both merchants and others. The book is popularly known today by the less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation and consists of eyewitness accounts of events during the first year of the settlement. Here's why that letter is important here. It is the only contemporaneous account of what we know as the first Thanksgiving which is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, longtime governor of the settlement, who wrote about it in his journal 10 or 12 years later. Even there, he just sort of brushes by it, endorsing Winslow by referring to not feigned but true reports. Quoting Bradford, "They now begin to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and having all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, of which every family had its portion. All summer long there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to the proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports." Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is built on. Everything beyond that is speculation, interpretation, some questionable third and fourth hand accounts, and guesswork. Some of it informed, all too much of it not. Now, some things we can tell from the accounts. Based on other references in those sources, we know the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it was late September or early October, as that would have been shortly after harvest. Which also means, by the way, that Winslow's account was written very likely no more than a month after the event. So yes, it was contemporaneous. Now, in considering the event, the first thing to realize is that this was not a Thanksgiving. To someone of the period, Thanksgiving was a religious occasion, a day set aside for prayer to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. In fact, the first public day of Thanksgiving in the town came in the summer of 1623. A 6-week crop-threatening drought had led to a day of humiliation, which is a day of fasting and prayer to beg forgiveness for whatever they had done, for God to call such a thing down on them. And literally that same evening, the rains came, and not a storm, but a gentle soaking rain which saved the crops. And so a day of Thanksgiving was felt to be an appropriate response. So no, this is not a Thanksgiving. Such days would occur occasionally as the cause arose. To plan for one in advance, especially to plan for one every year as we do now, would be regarded as a gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional, very English harvest feast, a celebration of a good harvest to which it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you over the course of the year, which is basically why the natives were there. They had been helpful, and so they were invited. And yes, that is the best explanation of their presence. The revisionists would have it that the natives simply crashed the party, but perhaps realizing that put the natives in a rather unfavorable light, that got revised to a version I first heard about 4 years ago, where natives who just happened to be in the vicinity of Plymouth heard the gunfire from the militia drills, assumed Plymouth was under attack, went 30 miles back to Massasoit's chief village, where he assembled a force and went 30 miles back to Plymouth to help. Did all this in the small time frame available, which frankly I find rather fanciful, especially when you note that Winslow's account displays no hint of either distress or surprise at the natives' presence. Now, one other thing here. Again, the settlers did not have a big harvest. Note that Bradford calls it small, but they had a harvest. I'm sure that raised everyone's spirits and indicated, yeah, we're going to make it. We're going to make it through, which is reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they'd been through to get to that point, including the death by disease, probably pneumonia, of half their numbers in the first couple of months. Now, I want to make a quick aside here to discuss a more subtle point more clearly. Europeans of the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts of the type that were the leaders of the Plymouth settlement, they did not make the sort of clear distinctions between what's religious and what's secular that we do today. The feeling of and awareness of the hand of God in everyday events was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest feast would surely have included prayers of thanks to God, perhaps a sermon from the religious leader, Elder William Brewster. They would have been significant features of the event, but they would not have been the purpose, the driving force behind the event. Celebration, feasting was the driving force. So the point is they would not have regarded this as a Thanksgiving as they understood the term. The prayers would have been central features, again, not the purpose. Put another way, had we been able to witness this 1621 event, to our modern eyes, there very likely would have been more than enough praying, giving thanks, singing of psalms and hymns and so on, to make us think that this was a religious or at least a religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, this would have looked, for lack of a better term, secular. Anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate, we can be confident that fowls such as duck or goose were there, as the governor sent 4 men on fowling in preparation. And yes, quite possibly turkey, of which they took many, Bradford said. We can also assume they had fish, specifically cod and bass, which are mentioned in the sources, and likely deer. Now, I'm going to make another aside here, because one of the things I'm going to be talking about repeatedly is how you have to interpret history. And this is on the issue here of historical interpretation, specifically of using historical sources without running too far ahead of what they actually say. That's a sin of which the revisionist accounts are repeatedly guilty, making too much out of too little. Now note that Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, but he also says, which they bestowed on our governor, that being William Bradford, and upon the captain, that being Miles Standish, and others. That is, they were given to various leaders of the community, not to the community as a whole. More to the point, we can't tell if those deer were brought to the feast and brought soon enough to be butchered, dressed, cooked, and presented as part of that feast, or if they were brought afterwards as a sort of thank you, a reciprocal gift in return for having been feasted for 3 days, which personally I actually find a little more likely because of Winslow saying the natives went out and killed 5 deer rather than they brought 5 deer to the feast. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't change anything because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which obviously includes deer, but just as obviously is not limited to it. In fact, in the period, hare, the meat of hare, was called venison. So while they quite probably had deer, either from the natives or from their own hunting or both, we actually don't know for certain. So, getting back to the menu. Lobster and other shellfish is another, again, real possibility. Elsewhere in the letter that I quoted, Winslow mentions that they are abundant in the area, as are eels, which he claims they could take a hogshead in a night. And if you happen to think eels, ew, realize that an English person of the period would have said, they're another sort of fish, what's the big deal? As for the hogshead in a night, a hogshead is a cask holding 63 gallons of liquid, which means Winslow was probably exaggerating, and yeah, he could do that. Beyond that, for what they ate, we can reasonably argue for some other food, such as a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweet with dried fruit, which they would have brought from England, salad from other stuff in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Now again, some interpretation here, again, only to show its importance in considering history. Some argue that there could not have been pie or bread at the feast because the settlement had no oven. Now, it's true the primary sources make no mention of ovens either way in the first years. Either we built some or we wish we had some. But there are a number of mentions of bread in various contexts. And with bread being such a staple of the English diet, personally I find it hard to accept that they got as far as harvest without having made at least a few ovens in order to make the use of the grains they grew, which were for bread. But again, my real point here is not so much to argue for my interpretation of this, as to point out how much interpretation goes into judging history. We have to tread carefully. Moving on, water would have been the major and quite possibly the only beverage available. Their supply of barley would be limited, as Winslow says, the English grains, which would include wheat, rye, and oats along with barley. He said they grew indifferent good. And there's no mention at all of hops anywhere, which no hops, no beer, not much barley, not much ale. And even if they did have some barley, they may not have had enough time to brew since harvest before the feast. And while they did bring beer with them on the voyage, it's very, very unlikely that there was any significant amount of that left nearly a year later. So while they might have had a little ale and even maybe a little wine brought from England and saved for a special occasion, again, it was likely mostly and possibly only water. By the way, one classic of revisionism is the claim that the settlers were persistently drunk because they drank a gallon of beer a day, preferring it, in the words of a number of them, even to water. Well, beer was preferred to water for two reasons. One, being made from grains, it provides some level of nutrition beyond that water provides. In fact, in the period, beer was sometimes called liquid bread. The other is that it keeps longer. Water will spoil. Warm, even tepid water is a good breeding ground for bacteria. Beer is boiled in the course of making it, and it contains alcohol, with both of which serve to kill germs. Now, the settlers didn't know anything about germs, of course, but they did know the effects. Beer keeps longer. As for the gallon a day, well, if you've been gradually introduced to beer ever since you were weaned, then a gallon a day, frankly, doesn't seem like all that much. That doesn't mean nobody ever got drunk. It does mean it was not a routine occurrence. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event itself. Not much to build a mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pies, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came from the Great Plains, and pilgrims dressed in fashions from the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail. And one of the reasons I go through this almost every year is probably a good part of the reason is that the event provides such latitude to those who want to replace the childhood and childish images of noble settlers and savage natives we got spoon-fed as children to one of savage settlers and noble natives. Those revisionists every year, regular as clockwork, treat us to stories that had become as traditional as cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we were spoon-fed as children, we find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing off with natives crashing the party, and who did it in such numbers because Massasoit feared he'd be kidnapped or killed otherwise. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, is an attempt to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, pure bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between Plymouth and the neighboring natives were reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and disruptions, yes, but for the most part, they managed to keep intact the peace treaty mutual defense pact that they put together in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse. I won't get into all the reasons, but the biggest two were population pressure, which rose mostly out of Boston, and disputes over land that reflected a vast cultural differences between the settlers and the natives. For one specific, the natives had no concept of land ownership. It wasn't just that they didn't own the land or nobody owned the land or the Great Spirit owns the land. No, what it was is that the concept of land as something that could be owned, could be possessed, didn't exist. How can you own something if you have to carry it away with you every time you go anywhere? Which makes real sense for a people who are semi-nomadic, who live in one part of one area for one part of the year, and another area another part of the year, and when they go, just pick up everything and carry it with them. But for the settlers, for any European, land ownership, which by its nature includes the concept of exclusive use, was an everyday concept. That cultural chasm was a source of repeated conflict. Now, the peace finally, irrevocably, completely broke down, but that was in 1675, more than 50 years after the first Thanksgiving. And the point here was that at that time, in the fall of 1621, native settler relations were good. In fact, the very next sentences of that Winslow letter I quoted are these: "We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them." Winslow also says that all the other native leaders in the vicinity have made peace with Plymouth on the same terms as Massasoit, as a result of which, he asserts, there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. He goes on to say that, quoting again, "We for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways in England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us. They are a people without any knowledge or any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just." Now, just to be certain you know, trusty means trustworthy, not trusting. Quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to understand, quick to grasp the meaning of something. Now, as for religion, in his later book, Good News from New England, published in 1624, Winslow says, "Therein I erred," and goes on to ascribe the native religion, at least as he best understands it. Now, that does not sound either like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives, or natives who feared contact with those same settlers, or thought they had to display mass force in order to avoid being kidnapped or killed. If you're still not convinced, consider that in June 1621, 3 or 4 months earlier, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit asking him to constrain his people from coming to the town so often in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation. This is the heart of the message they sent to Massasoit. "But whereas his people came very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome. Yet we, being but strangers as yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and as we desired still to do." That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers. So afraid of them that the settlers felt they had to ask, "Please, just don't come around so much, so many of you." Assigning the role of angel or demon to either of these peoples is trash. Neither of them were angels, neither of them were demons. So I reject the revisionist history. Indeed, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it first because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not scholarship. And is every bit full of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap that we got fed as school children. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 was a scene of peaceful and friendly relations, of good feeling between English settlers and their nearest native neighbors. The first Thanksgiving was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were still wary of each other, they still felt, we're going to be able to work this out. This is going to be cool. That wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. It was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous understanding no more than a few decades, and a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty towards and genocide of the native peoples of this continent, such that while the first Thanksgiving shouldn't be a source of happily ever after, why can't we all just get along fairy tales, neither is there any need to co-opt it into the service of an ideologically driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist. And frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine some years ago talking about the urge to find angelic forces in the world. That is the seeming need many of us have to fix on some group, some movement, something that we can convince ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and its behavior. In our attempts to find some better balance in our understanding of what was done to the natives of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry directed toward them and still directed toward them, too many of us, in considering the Pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen simply to swap one mythology for a perhaps more satisfying but equally false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. I'm going to wrap this up with a few quick sidebars about the time before the period that I've talked about here, before that fall. A few details surrounding those first months that you might find interesting. First, you often hear the Mayflower referred to as a small ship, and to our modern eyes, it certainly is. But at 180 ton, it was actually somewhat larger than an average merchant ship of the period, which ran around 140 to 160 ton. A ton, by the way, being a large cask that became a standard measure of the capacity of a ship's hold. You want to see a small ship? There was a ship that came to settlement, came to Plymouth in 1623, called the Little James. It was 30 ton. You often hear, by the way, that the passengers came for religious freedom. They didn't. First, that would have applied only to a minority of those on the Mayflower. Not only did they not believe in religious freedom as we understand the term, freedom being equated with anarchy, to the degree they sought what they would have called liberty of conscience. Those who had been to Holland, which was that minority on the Mayflower, had it there. In fact, that's why they went to Holland, because they refused to be part of the Church of England. As I mentioned before, they were deemed criminals. Unfortunately for them, they not only found such liberty in Holland, they also found poverty of a degree that they feared was fracturing their small community. In fact, they felt it was dissolving before their eyes. That's why they came to this continent. As for the rest, the majority of those in the Mayflower, they came for that most American of reasons, a better life. Especially because England was actually going through a depression at the time, which is itself an interesting story, but for another time. It's also been asserted that the first winter was marked by starvation, that in fact they all would have starved to death but for the corn which they stole from a cache on Cape Cod. Okay, this is partly true. The deaths came, as I said earlier, from disease, probably pneumonia, not starvation. The ship's stores provided food for the winter, which could be supplemented by fishing. What is true is that they stole corn. But that was seed corn for the following spring, which makes it incredibly unlikely that it was a quantity sufficient to feed the entire group of people for the entire winter. Make no mistake, though. This involved disturbing some graves, which was a really incredibly scummy thing to do, and that it wasn't the only scummy thing they did. They actually stole some things from some of the houses they came because they regarded them as what a modern person might call interesting artifacts. Now, in fairness, they promised themselves they would make good for whatever they took, which they did when they were able to contact those natives, the Nauset, the following spring. But while that mitigates the wrong, it does not excuse it. Finally, they were not greeted by the indigenous people. In fact, they didn't speak to a native till March, and that was the Samoset and Abenaki, who from what's now Maine. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after that that they first spoke to a local who was Squanto. Those indigenous people finally would not have called themselves Wampanoag. That's a native word that means something like people of the dawn or people of the east, and it's been adopted by the natives of eastern Massachusetts as a general term for all the natives of the vicinity. But no native of the period would have said, I am Wampanoag, because that would mean I live to the east of where I live, which obviously makes no sense. So, I hope you enjoyed your Turkey Day. I hope you had a time to spend with your family, your friends, or both. And I hope you understand why I celebrate the day as an expression of hope for the future. A hope which may prove to be as foolish as that of 1621, but which remains the one absolute necessary requirement for any efforts to make that future a better one. That said, I'm gone. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. As always, peace.